All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me on this fine Friday here in November. Um, Ready to kick off the stream. Accepting questions. If you guys have a question, feel free to type them in the Twitch chat. I am here to answer your questions. Ask me anything. We are going to be covering today Cannabis or Bust from around the nation. What is going on Capitol Hill and how it impacts the cannabis industry, new items in cannabis science, and really what the heck is going on here in Michigan. Also, if you are watching the stream and you're on Twitch, please know that there are Pokemon to be caught. I am still a Pokemoner. I know. I think many of us in my generation are, and you are welcome to catch some. They're usually 3 or 4 to be caught during the show. It is a Pokemon community game with the Twitch community that you can participate in. Okay, so getting right on to it, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about what's happening here with Cannabis Busts. I like to start the show out with this every week. A lot of people think that cannabis is legal now because it's easy for them to get, and it's probably been decriminalized where they live, but it is not legal. There are still lots of places that you can get arrested for cannabis. Even in legalized states, people are still arrested for cannabis all the time. Last year, almost 250,000 people went to prison for cannabis arrests. Majority of those were still arrests for basic possession. There are still people who are arrested all the time for moving cannabis from one state to another. There are still kids who are busted for using cannabis in their own homes and at school. This happens. It is, the war on drugs is not over. Certainly the war on cannabis is not over, and it is a good thing to have that reminder. In addition, there are still over 30,000 people that are serving time behind bars for cannabis. A lot of people who get arrested for cannabis may not actually end up in prison, but that does not mean that they are able to participate fully. A lot of you may have recalled that there was an election on Tuesday. Cannabis in most places is still a felony, which in most states, but not all, means that you are no longer allowed to vote. So, a cannabis arrest can lead to that. Cannabis arrest can lead to not being able to get home loans. It can lead to not being able to get a job. It can lead to having your kids taken away. It can lead to not being able to get student loans to further your education and do better for yourself and your family. There are a lot of things that are impacted there, and there are a lot of people who, when I say to them, there are people currently serving life sentences for selling cannabis, they are a little flabbergasted. I still am, even though I have known this for over several decades now, that cannabis is like 10 years to life for most people. And that is a sad reality in our country. And it's also a sad reality that, something like 80% of all of the prosecutions that are happening are still happening for cannabis, as far as arrests are concerned. So when you think about, hey, we might have these other drugs that we think of as more dangerous, more detrimental to our communities, you're certainly killing more people than cannabis ever has. Still 80% of the drug arrests in the country and prosecutions in the country are for the sacred plant and not for other substances. If you're thinking, oh, those drug busts are just for, people who are pushing opiates on children or bringing in fentanyl from overseas, no, actually, it's still cannabis consumers and those that grow cannabis and bring cannabis to cannabis consumers that are being busted. Speaking of which, just this past week, young man was arrested for having a vape cart, which he was allowed to legally purchase in Texas, in school. And, I mention oftentimes to people about, hey, Texas is now working towards decriminalization. There were even additional municipalities that decriminalized in Texas this past election that was just on Tuesday. But still, Texas is the number one place that people get arrested and go to prison for cannabis in the country. It has been number one for the last 7 years in a row. It is not a joke in Texas. Why do people keep doing this to themselves? I assume it's because they need access to the plant. What I don't really understand is why you would need to take a few puffs between classes for a substance like this. Why not just leave school? Why bring it to school with you? Certainly when I was a youth, it was not that people were not consuming cannabis. It was that they didn't do it on school grounds. perhaps now decriminalization is making students more brazen. This young man will probably not get to continue his education and will have his future stolen because of the war on drugs. Is that really what's necessary in this case? I'm not sure, but certainly the people in Texas seem to think that prosecuting children for making mistakes like this is the right thing to do. I talk a lot about other states that are legal and where people are getting arrested still. A good example of this is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has had a licensed legal program for a long time now. Huge arrests have been happening in Pennsylvania. Most of these arrests are happening as people are trying to leave Pennsylvania and go to other states that also have legal programs. I assume because Pennsylvania has a surplus of cannabis, and other surrounding states might not. I think this is always interesting because there have been several bills that have been floated in Congress that never go anywhere, that talk about allowing interstate interactions where, perhaps Maryland doesn't grow enough weed of its own, but its surrounding states do. Or, maybe we say, hey, Michigan grows way too much cannabis. Let's allow it to go to Illinois and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and whatnot. Or maybe even international trade. But for sure, people who are doing this are still getting arrested. And they're being charged with drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is a pretty big felony. And you will go to prison for a long time, if not life. Is that where we want to be spending our tax dollars? I think it's important for us to consider that, And I think now that we know that Trump has been elected president, we should be asking, would he like to allow legalization? Would he like to allow interstate trade, say, between Oregon and Washington and California? Would he, be okay with that? Does he want to allow international trade with our other parties like Canada, like South Africa, like the European Union, like Australia, where these products are also grown and they are allowed in medical markets? Are we going to, all of a sudden become the cannabis cultivation capital of the world? I mean, I always thought it was California, but apparently, Pennsylvania is a place to export cannabis from now, right into, the great state of New York, I guess. It's a little bit crazy to me to think just how much we're continuing this war on drugs. We're talking billions of dollars every year. Is that what we want? I don't think so. However, there are still states out there that are 100% not voting to allow medical access, right? So maybe I am wrong. Maybe people really do think that the plant shouldn't be allowed anywhere, even though, 38 states have licensed programs. Speaking of states that don't have licensed programs, Nebraska just had another person arrested for drug trafficking there. Nebraska is one of the last 3 states to have no program at all. Doesn't even want to allow cannabinoids derived from hemp in the state. And, it's interesting to me because I used to say things like, well, only in Nebraska would people do things that are this silly. But in this case, it wasn't just Nebraska. It was also Florida. It was also South Dakota. It was also North Dakota. It was also Massachusetts, who are, voting instead to expand access to the plant to trap it down. In this case, hundreds of pounds of cannabis were seized, along with some other drugs that are not cannabis, from a drug trafficker on his way through Nebraska, where, again, why go through Nebraska? It's one of the only states that still is, very hardline against this. So much so that even though Nebraskans, over 70% of them voted to legalize cannabis for medical use in the state of Nebraska, that people have taken them to court and are trying to say that even though the voters clearly want it, 70% is a huge amount of people to vote for something. 70% of people don't agree on much ever, but they 100% agreed that medical access should be allowed in Nebraska. But the courts are going to decide, and, because a small minority of individuals don't want people in Nebraska to have access to this sacred plant. I still don't really understand. Drake Detroit, thank you so much for commenting in the live stream chat. Yeah, Drake has said here, Trump legalized hemp production, and that led to what we have today. Biden legalized research, though, which was equally as big, in your opinion. I agree. Us being, having a president that was willing to sign into law the 2018 hemp bill, that was huge. It has changed everything. Having a Senate that was led by Mitch McConnell put that forward and allow that section of the Farm Bill to be made, it was huge. It 100% has created what we have today, which, is a market that is still state-driven, that still has a lot of regulations that haven't caught up, that is leading to innovations across the country. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see some movement there. I'm hopeful that that movement won't remove access from anybody around the country. Like that for me. My focus is always on people should have access to this plant. They shouldn't be afraid to go to prison because of this plant, right? Farmers shouldn't be afraid that they're going to go to jail because they're growing a plant, and consumers shouldn't be afraid that they're going to go to jail because they need some relief from what ails them. Thinking about that, other things happening on Capitol Hill. By now, probably you are aware that Trump has won a second term in office, and that could mean a lot of things for cannabis. A couple of things to note, which we discussed last week before the election was over, was that Trump had come out saying that he is for safe banking, which is huge for licensed cannabis operators and hemp operators, I might add, because hemp operators still struggle with getting access to all of the banking that they otherwise should be allowed to do, because there is a stigma around the plant regardless of what it's being grown to be used for. And Trump has said that he thinks rescheduling should continue, which is excellent. He also was a proponent for Florida's legalization, which failed. I know we're all wondering, like, will that mean that he will fight harder for it because he knows that DeSantis doesn't like it, and I guess they have a personal grudge against each other? Who knows? But, that is to be expected. We can also expect that there might be some changes to agricultural policy under Trump. There were previously, and those things might actually be good for hemp farmers across the country. And one of the things I think people often forget is that even though we could be growing all the hemp right here in the United States, that we are still importing a majority of the hemp that is used in our country from out of country, from places like China and Thailand, which kind of boggles my mind when you consider just how much arable land that can be used to grow this great plant is available here in the United States. Nobody has to do anything else like that. Some other items, I know I mentioned that Nebraska voted yes to allow medical access in the state of Nebraska. I think that's really big. My sister actually was living in Nebraska for quite some years, and we would never go visit because there was not a program that was reciprocal, and my wife needs access to cannabis for her to live. Right? Otherwise she has pretty debilitating muscle spasms that caused by the multiple sclerosis make it so that she can't walk, she can't eat, and that is not okay, right? You can't go visit somebody when you can't walk and can't eat. But sadly, in Nebraska, the courts will decide, because people are already litigating to prevent this ballot measure from taking effect. They started litigating against it even before the voters had voted. So it's interesting to think that even though people might have been aware that their votes will be overturned, over 70% of them still voted to give access, which I think is pretty amazing. If we kind of move a little bit further along on that, Trump has said that there's going to be quite a bit of new tariffs. He's talking about putting these tariffs back in place on day one. It is worth noting that we did already see what this looked like. And I know sometimes people think that the tariffs have actually gone away under the Biden administration, but strangely enough, that is not the case. The tariffs were still there. They were maintained. In fact, the Biden administration fought to keep them in place against the World Trade Organization across most of the tariffs that were put in place. I think if there are more, I guess we could see even more, but perhaps he will just say that he's keeping them in place. I'm not really sure what that would look like. Things that we did see, though, was a pretty steep increase on the cost of nutrients that are used for farmers of all things, not just cannabis and hemp products. We saw an increase on materials used to make vaping devices and machinery and equipment. We also saw a pretty steep increase on machinery itself, since a lot of machinery is built with parts that are made overseas and were impacted by these tariffs. The tariffs, the direct impact on prices is because people were willing to pay the tariff and then pass that along to consumers. At some point, maybe consumers will say that they're not willing to accept the raised prices. I guess it didn't happen last time, but maybe it'll happen this time because people really don't seem to like inflation here in the United States. So I suppose that's possible. Imported hemp is kind of huge. If we were to have tariffs, it would be something that could be very quickly turned over and grown here in the United States. I think that would be pretty amazing if we all of a sudden no longer were importing more hemp than we were exporting, if we were no longer importing more hemp than we were growing here in the United States by ourselves. Maybe that's a market where people can kind of jump right in, think, and when we're talking about hemp in this case, guys, it's not necessarily for cannabinoid production. Think textiles, think clothes, shirts, ties, shoes, building materials, hempcrete, concrete, plastics, hemp seeds, hemp hearts, hemp oil, cosmetics, those kinds of things. Those are all things that currently we are not making domestically, that we could potentially, and maybe the tariffs would impact that. It would be really great to see that. If you are interested in this, I'm going to go ahead and throw a link to the Department of Ag's weekly report on hemp production and imports. It is pretty clear. They do this every week. They don't just do this for hemp, okay, guys? It's not like, oh wow, hemp is so special. They do it for cotton, they do it for soybeans, they do it for corn. The ag department covers all of the imports, exports, and domestic production of most agricultural products, because we are still an agricultural country, even with all like the innovations that we've made. I think that's good. Going back to what Drake Detroit said, I think it's important to think about the research that's been legalized and all of the science that's come out of that. The MMR is a pretty big deal, and that work is important, that work on toxicology. Just this past week, there's a new study, which was a collaboration against from many people, including NIH, but that was done as a study out of London. In this case, what was done was, hey, if you are using cannabis, are you getting any changes to your DNA? And what was shown was that, well, maybe not any actual mutation of the DNA, but methylation is occurring. And when that methylation occurs, it's occurring in sections of our DNA, which impacts a few things, specifically how we interact with our mitochondria, how our immune systems work, as well as some items related to how we interact with mental health and potential psychosis. I thought it was quite interesting study. There were definitely some issues which the study report indicates. Most of the people who were reporting any information here also have to be tobacco users at one point in their life. They were unable to remove that. 85% of the cannabis users were also tobacco users. And of course, as we all know, after decades of research, tobacco use does cause some pretty significant changes. But they did believe that because they still saw these changes in the DNA in people who were not cannabis users, that it's possible that is not going to be the case. Also, I thought it was really interesting that they said that most cannabis users consume their cannabis with tobacco. I feel like that must only be something in the UK, or maybe at least just not in the US. I'm certainly not a cannabis user who also is consuming it with tobacco at the same time. I know there's plenty of people who do blunts and blunt wraps and those kinds of things. But apparently they're saying that, most people were mixing loose tobacco with loose cannabis and making mixed cigarettes. Gotta love how things are different in all different parts of the world. If only I learned just that about those that smoke weed in London. 85% of them all, consuming it alongside tobacco in perhaps even the same pipe. That is a good cultural thing for me to have learned from this scientific journal. Some other items that were included in here, though, had to do with those evolutionary interactions. We talk a lot about how our body has an endocannabinoid system, and that is something that evolved with us. And that means that we evolved with plants that provide these cannabinoids that are going to interact with that endocannabinoid system. That our body also creates like natural cannabinoids inside of us, right? That we don't have to have the phytocannabinoids because we're already creating these things that interact with our cannabinoid system. And what does that look like? And how can we see that in the future? I think given that we really were coming into the science of medicine at the same time that we were making cannabis illegal around the world, that it's very possible that we're going to find out all kinds of things. One of the things they noticed was that it seemed to have an impact on aging. So if cannabis, I don't know, makes you younger when you consume it, that would be great. About a month ago now, we reported that if you had cannabis usage during your youth, that you had a lesser prevalence of dementia. If you had we also showed if you had cannabis use during your youth, you had less chance, of stroke or heart attack, right? So, there are a lot of places where things that might make you die, like having a cruddy immune system, that, cannabis might actually be a supplement. And we are seeing, more and more research that, is being allowed by the MMR in the United States to show this. I think it's possible that now we're able to actually have tests to look at our genome that we never could have had. Back when people were using cannabis consistently, that it was consistently in our food supply, I'm talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, we just didn't have the kind of medical acumen to be able to know that what we were doing was going to harm us generationally, right? This is very similar. I don't know if you guys listen to the Science Fridays, okay? But on Science Fridays this past week, one of the things we were talking about was the evolutionary connection between animals eating fermented fruit and us as humans having an enzyme that digests alcohol and makes it into calories that we can use, to feed our brains and the rest of our bodies, right? Like, there are lots of creatures out there that do not have this enzyme, so alcohol to them is not a food source, but for us it is, which is crazy, I know, but also the truth. And I think that it's important to kind of think about that here we are evolving an enzyme that's going to allow us to consume fermented fruit that has alcohol in it and still get nutritional value, right? In the same way that we've evolved to have an endocannabinoid system. And cannabis is improving our immune system, and it's improving, potentially impacting how we're aging, right? It's reducing inflammation in our bodies, right? Like, it might even, I know sometimes I think this is crazy, there is some research that shows that, cannabis might reduce the generation of sperm, which may potentially, for cannabis users, lead to not overpopulating. And if you're not overpopulating, right, then you have more food and more time for leisure and all those kinds of things. Like, I know sometimes it's like, oh, we want to be able to procreate as much as possible, but there are also reasons to not, and having substances that you consume that tamp those the ability of sperm to fertilize eggs could be important from a standpoint of, hey, a community that's consuming a lot of these products might not be having, 12 children, instead they only have 4. And I know 12 sounds crazy, but it was not so long ago that there were no options for birth control, and really it was going to be, basically anytime you were procreating, you were going to actually have to have a kid. It's a big thing to consider there, and how that impacts our immune systems and how that impacts aging. Because if there's anything that I know for certain, is that being a parent ages you. Just going to throw that out there. Drake Detroit here is saying here that they met some Mormons from Utah that would smoke weed mixed with tobacco out of a homemade bong. Yeah, that sounds pretty legit. I mean, I've definitely met people who were smoking with hookahs, and the hookah was used for both things. And I know a lot of people who are still using tobacco leaf blunt wraps that are smoking. I just never really considered people rolling their own cigarettes and just throwing some weed in there, right? So, but hey, I guess that's the way it rolls in London. Such is life. Okay, so moving on. Guys, I don't know what's going on here in Michigan, okay? We still don't have any draft rules to provide public comment on. I guess that's good. We just had a pretty big change up in the House here in Michigan. So now we have a number, like the control of Congress in Michigan has changed. That's probably going to lead to some changes in how people are approaching the legislature here. And that includes being able to review these draft rules. The big proponents for cannabis access that are here and for making modifications did actually win re-election this past Tuesday. So I was glad to see that. We those folks are still there, that we've been working with for a while now. So, and they're not term limited quite yet. So we get to keep working with them for a couple of more years, and I'm happy that is the case. But really, Next week, we should get the disciplinary action report. Probably you guys are aware that we had another big disciplinary formal complaint letter that went out about Trucentia this past week, where it appeared in the documentation that was provided to the stakeholders from the CRA that the complaint is about, having millions of grams and creating distillate from it and having more distillate that could possibly be there and not having things appropriately labeled. If you have millions of grams, you probably have enough to put them all in metric. So this is a bad actor is what people are saying, which makes me sad because I know I have definitely done work with them. They were involved with some of the first cannabis cups that, where they were putting backpacks together, and those backpacks were then going out to cannabis cup voters throughout the state. So I'm sad to see that happen to them. But, in our, enforcement focused state instead of business growth focused state, it is worth noting that regulators are out there looking, so you should be spending time making sure that your documents are correct. One of the things I thought was quite interesting was that, as soon as the CRA was on site, then they went around trying to get everything added into metric and were tagging everything, which of course then the CRA saw on the camera. So, right, it's as though people forget that they are always on camera. One of the things the CRA asked recently, or said is going to be in the new draft rules, would be that they want access to the security camera footage so they can look at us whenever they feel like it, instead of only asking us for it and then we give it to them later. Wow, just what we need. More of a police state for our operators. Okay, so, we're about halfway through today's show. I've covered the items here. I didn't get a lot of questions that weren't election related this week, guys. I don't even know how to say, what do we expect Trump to do other than we already know that Trump signed the hemp bill into law. We know that Trump said he was for recreational legalization in Florida. We know that he has indicated that he is down to allow safe banking to happen, to give licensed state operators the rights to do banking. What else might we expect? He has never mentioned anything about expungements. He's never mentioned anything about federal legalization. He mentioned that he might be okay with rescheduling, but made no commitments at all to what rescheduling would look like under his administration. We have no idea if he will even continue the rescheduling process. He could literally kill that on day one if he so decided. We really don't know. We do know that he is, was in support of making some changes in Florida that the voters of Florida did not choose to do. And we know that he has some pretty major campaign funders that are cannabis operators, some of the largest ones like Curaleaf that are out there, right? So, it's possible that he will be more friendly about this than we expect, but it does not seem to be terribly important to him. I am personally still concerned that he can, right up until the last week, he was saying that he hopes that we will make drug trafficking into a capital crime and will allow law enforcement to execute drug traffickers, which seems to, as I said earlier today in the top of the hour for Cannabis Busts, there were 2 people who were busted just last week for drug trafficking. Should they be put to death in Nebraska and Pennsylvania? I don't think so. And hopefully he's just, being sarcastic when he says that they should be killed. Again, because 85% of the people who are arrested in our country for drug trafficking are arrested for drug trafficking on cannabis. I know people like to focus on other substances when Trump is talking about it, but if it's only 15% of the arrests, does that mean that we're just going to not be making those arrests anymore? Or does that mean that, we're going to not call cannabis trafficking drug trafficking any longer? It's 250,000 people last year. Are all of those people not going to be, doing a capital crime? Are we going to create a special category for cannabis that is different than all other kinds of drug trafficking? I guess we could, but I don't really know. Yeah, Brandy, who will be the new attorney general? Any of the lawyers that are out there, I don't know if you saw, but uh, there were like a number of people who were floated recently, right? And like I don't know if you saw this here. I'll just read this here. Okay. It's the Mike Davis, okay? Who people are calling the leading person here, is talking about, being very unfriendly to, well, everyone, including drug traffickers, and also, a bunch of other people, that are really leaning into what Trump had to say about, being, dealing with the enemy from within, which I think is interesting, from a standpoint of, a lot of people are saying that it's sarcasm. So for people to say this, in a not sarcastic, policy driven way, I think is a little surprising to most of us. And I think that we won't actually know. Last time I checked, he had not provided any tickets. Last time I checked, he was still working through the process with the GSA to transfer himself to power. So there you are, as far as that's concerned. In general, though, the question that I think Brandy is asking here is not who will it actually be, but will that person continue to use discretion in prosecuting patients and patient caregivers and cultivators and states across the country. As I'm sure you guys are aware, there is an amendment that is included in the omnibus for the budget every year. Trump in the past has talked about not including that amendment. If that amendment's not there, then there is nothing to prevent the Department of Justice and the DEA and the Department of Homeland Security and all of these other folks, like, Customs and Border Patrol, from harassing patients and caregivers around the country. Again, like at the top of the hour, we talk about this often, and about people being arrested and people feeling very comfortable because things have been legal for, a decade or so now. But again, things are not actually legal at the federal level. It's state level. It's literally amendments to bills that are preventing the Department of Justice from spending money to prosecute people that are operating in legal states. And that includes patients, and it includes the people providing medicine to patients, of which there are like 30 million registered patients who are on lists, right? So it is possible that, these people could change their minds, and I feel like occasionally people forget that, right? People get complacent. They think, oh, wow, I can have this anytime I want it. Yeah, you can have this anytime you want it, because hundreds of thousands of patients and cultivators went to prison on your behalf and are still there today in some cases, and still have records today that are preventing them from getting access to homes, to getting access from educations, from being able to maintain their children, from being able to get the job that they want because they can't have the job because they have a felony on their record for being a patient and consuming medicine, right? Like that is the truth. I feel like people really forget that sometimes. And I think that they also forget that the last couple of attorney generals for Trump, of which he did have two, were not in favor of legalization and were actively continuing to persecute people. So we can expect the same. Although I think Trump likes to do the unexpected, so maybe we will get exactly the opposite. Maybe he will be like, I want to continue to have Merrick Garland be the attorney general. I guess it's possible. Brandy has also asked who will be the new majority leaders. This is too soon to know. There is so much infighting within the Republican Party. They barely were able to get a leader of the House previously. That was really uncomfortable, I think, for everyone. Certainly it seemed uncomfortable to watch them fight each other over very basic things. At least that's how it appeared to me. I think that the more salient question would be, will those changes, lead to anything that will impact us in the cannabis industry? I know that Americans for Safe Access is having a good conversation about this, because patients' lives are at risk, right? It's one thing to be a recreational user and just want to enjoy it, but it's another to be a user like my wife, where without having access to cannabis, you're going to have debilitating muscle spasms and being incapable of walking. You're going to not be able to eat, right? You're going to have difficulty with your bowels. You're going to, like, all of these things that come from having access to the plant and consistent access to the plant, that made my family a family of American medical refugees, as we left a state where we didn't have access and moved to a state where we could have access, and have continued to only go to states and visit states where access is allowed, because this is a life-saving medication, right? Like, I think those things are appropriate for people to be considering. And while at the same time, I also believe that the arms of the government are long, but they are also wrapped in red tape. So we might have a little bit longer to figure it out than day one. I know there's a lot of people who think that, like, day one things just happen. I don't agree with that sentiment. I think that day one, there's not a lot that can happen. There wasn't a lot that happened last time. I feel like it takes a lot longer to, like, get people organized than 24 hours. But I guess I could be wrong. You never know. It is, I suppose, possible. Yeah, so Brandy, I hope that was a really roundabout answer of not answering it. So forgive me for that. We know that it's not going to be Mitch McConnell, right? He said he doesn't want to be the majority leader of the Senate. So who might that be? Right now there is not a front runner, and that's just the truth. So there you go. Okay. All right. So, woo. Okay, guys, hear this? This is them talking about what this looks like right now. I don't know if people can hear it or see it. I am terrible at this. Okay, I'm just going to stop it. It doesn't seem like you guys can. You'd think 21 episodes in that I would, like, be better at using these streaming tools, but, like, I'm trying to, like, show you guys the same thing where it actually talks about the three candidates that are right now vying for control of the Senate. They are all Republicans, and apparently I couldn't make that happen, so forgive me. But they do exist. And the last time I checked, maybe I should check again, House of Representatives election, is it over? Because I felt like we weren't certain yet on that. So yeah, nope, it looks pretty certain to me, right? So probably the same person will still have that. Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's weird. They're still saying that there's a chance. I don't know that there's a chance. I feel like every time somebody tells me that there's a chance that reality isn't reality, that they're probably smoking something better than my weed. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I feel like it's going to be a short show. Probably that's a good thing. That means not too much was happening in the state of Michigan. There weren't too many arrests going on around the country. If I, can encourage you all to swing by my Patreon. I have about 7 people who have responded to my survey about what we want to see in upcoming episodes. Most people are saying what I'm presenting on is what they want to see, which is great. We have a couple people saying, hey, would you add some of these things in? I'd love to know your opinions, so please share it with me. And if you're interested in being on the show, I really love having another talking head here with me. So please reach out, and I will try to make that happen. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a really good rest of your Friday and enjoy your weekend, and I will see you next week.